Hi guys, this is the last video discussing How I Became a Hindu by Sitaram Goel. And here we will continue the discussion of his views on the Ayodhya movement of 1991 and his meeting and views on famous historian Koenraad Elst. Meanwhile, the Ayodhya movement had gathered momentum after the 1989 general elections in which the BJP achieved spectacular success. It was in December 1989 that a Belgian young man, Koenraad Elst, dropped in at my office. He had picked up a copy of my book, History of Hindu-Christian Encounters, from some bookshop and had become keen to see me after reading it. I loved reading this part because it was so interesting, because Koenraad Elst in a YouTube video has described the situation from his viewpoint, that he finds the book, he comes to India, finds that book, reads that book and then asks around, and people say that, oh, you want to meet Sitaram Goel? He lives nearby. And then he goes to meet him, and now we are reading that same incident from Sitaram Goel's viewpoint. We discussed the character of what was being described as Hindu awakening. I gave him some of Voice of India publications, and he went away to Ayodhya and Varanasi. When he returned after 2 weeks, he expressed surprise that he had not been able to locate a single book representing the Hindu case on Ayodhya. I told him that in late 1983, a VHP leader, Vishwa Hindu Parishad leader, had collared me after a seminar and asked if I had any proof that a temple existed where the Babri mosque stood at present. I had expected the VHP to produce some literature during the 6 years that had passed since then. Koenraad Elst was, however, aware that Dr. Harsh Narayan and A.K. Chatterjee had come out with positive proofs in the meanwhile. I then took him to Ram Swarup, as I do in the case of everybody who comes to me and shows sympathy for Hindu causes. On the eve of his departure, Koenraad Elst asked me if I would publish a book on Ayodhya which he planned to write on his return to Belgium. I did not take him seriously. I did not know at that time that the 31 years old Belgian we had met was a prodigy, and that he felt so deeply about Hindus having a good case but presenting it very badly. The script of his Ram Janmabhoomi versus Babri Masjid, a case study in the Hindu-Muslim conflict, was dropped on my table by the postman exactly after a month. I could not stop after I started reading it. I took it to Ram Swarup the same evening. He read it during the night and rang me up next morning. How fast do these people read books? Koenraad Elst's book, he said, should be published immediately. I had just published a book, Hindu Temples, What Had Happened to Them, Volume 1, a preliminary survey. This book is, of course, you must know, is legendary. You guys absolutely have to read this. It carried the articles by Arun Shori, Dr. Harsh Narayan, Ram Swarup and myself, published in the Indian Express. 2 articles which Jai Dubashi had written in the Organizer, the weekly magazine of RSS. Organizer, on the significance of the Shilanyasa at Ayodhya simultaneously with the fall of the Berlin Wall, were added to it. I also wrote a new chapter, Let the Mute Witnesses Speak, for this book. This chapter carried a list of around 2,000 Muslim monuments, which according to literary and or archaeological evidence stood on the sites of Hindu temples and or had Hindu sculptures embedded in their masonry. The location of these Muslim monuments was also indicated in the list, place-wise, district-wise and state-wise. The list has now become famous, though it touches only the tip of the iceberg. Soon after Koenraad Elst's book was also ready, Ram Swarup and I went to Sri L.K. Advani for requesting him to release the 2 books in a public function. He agreed, though he was not quite keen about the compilation on Hindu temples in general, and he used the public function on 13th August 1990 for announcing that he would try to persuade the VHP to drop their claims on the sites of the Vishwanath temple at Varanasi and the Krishna Janmabhoomi at Mathura, provided the Muslims agreed to give up the Ram Janmabhoomi site at Ayodhya. At the same time, he chided me for using strong language. Sitaram ji to tikhe ho jate hain. Quoting L.K. Advani. I wondered if he had read my articles in the book on temples. A friend who had known and relished my earlier style had chided me for making my style scholarly. The people present were stunned. Girilal Jain, who presided over the function, minced no words while pointing out that the much applauded Hindu tolerance was nothing more than Hindu cowardice most of the time. But none of this appeared in the press next morning. It was Advani's offer which became the front page news. Dr. Harsh Narayan and Koenraad Elst had documented how Syed Shahabuddin had kept shifting his ground regarding proof about the destruction of the Ram Mandir at Ayodhya. But the VHP BJP combine was more than willing to provide more proofs. In fact, the stronger the proofs the Hindu scholars provided, the greater became the Muslim demand for something more solid. This is called goalpost shifting in modern terminology. The leaders of the Ayodhya movement had walked into the trap laid by likes of Shahabuddin in spite of my repeated warnings that Hindus should do the questioning and make the Muslims do the answering. But these leaders were innocents abroad, having no knowledge of Islamic theology or Islamic history. Gross ignorance is quite often the straw to which optimism clings. This is a beautiful quote. Gross ignorance is quite often the straw to which optimism clings. All this while the Muslim leaders kept looking down upon the Hindu beggars standing before them with folded hands. I was of the opinion that the building of the new Rama Mandir could wait till such time as the BJP got a mandate from the people. The first priority, I thought, should go to educating the people about Islam, which has a little bit started only now, that too thanks to Sanjay Dixit. But by now the Rama Mandir at Ayodhya had become an end in itself for the VHP BJP combine. They were prepared to try any number of tricks, tell any number of lies, and suffer any amount of humiliation only if they could get their toy assembled at Ayodhya. I need not narrate the rest of the story, which is well known. The leaders of the Ayodhya movement were soon proclaiming from the housetops that Islam did not permit destruction of other people's places of worship. They took no notice of my book, Hindu Temples What Happened to Them Volume 2, The Islamic Evidence, in which I had quoted from scores of histories written by pious Muslim historians, to the effect that destroying Hindu temples and replacing them with mosques was a favorite pastime of Muslim rulers, down to the fall of the Mughal dynasty. I had also included in this book a chapter, Islamic Theology of Iconoclasm, to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that destroying the other people's places of worship was a pious performance in Islam because the Prophet himself had destroyed all pre-Islamic pagan temples in Arabia. The leaders of the Ayodhya movement were out to flatter Islam in order to coax the Muslims to part voluntarily with the Ram Janmabhoomi site. They got nowhere. With that, we come to the end of this video. This is not the end of the book, there's another chapter, but I highly recommend you guys read this book. This book needs to be read. It's very cheap and very small. This is very short. And Sitaram Goel is almost a forgotten man, and he is very underrated as a writer. He is very underrated as a historian. And hope you guys, the next generation, do justice to his legacy, to his memories, and to his efforts that he had put in.